Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Corey Folsom. I'm the Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon, Connecticut. And Audubon, Connecticut, along with the Connecticut Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy, make up the Audubon Alliance, which is a partnership that assists the state of Connecticut's Wildlife Division with the stewardship and management of our beach nesting birds. On the call today, we have myself, Laura Saucier, who is from the Wildlife Division, Scott Kroibosch, who is our volunteer coordinator, Martha Rice from the Nature Conservancy, Beth Amendola, who's the coastal program coordinator for Audubon, Connecticut. And then we have Joe Atwater representing Connecticut Audubon Society's Roger Troy Peterson Estuary Center. Glad to have you all joining us this morning for the new volunteer training. I'm going to mute everybody during the presentations, but if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat. And then we will also pause for any, a couple of questions at the end of, say, Laura's presentation or Scott's presentation. I also, if you can quickly put your name in the chat, that would be great, just so we can kind of take attendance of folks that are here today. So you can see a slide about the Alliance in front of you right now. Actually, let me get this on. But then here is a sort of a schedule for today's presentation. So we'll be hearing from Laura Saucier first on piping plover, natural history and behavior, shorebird management practices and fieldwork, and being a good witness. And I'll be talking briefly about American oystercatcher natural history and reporting bands. Then Scott will be going into all the details of data reporting and scheduling. And then we'll take whatever time we need at the end to answer questions. So with that, I think we'll get started. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Laura, I'll let you start sharing your screen.
Okay. My slide share. Okay, sweet. Thanks, Corey. Okay, good morning. My name is Laura Saucier. I'm a Wildlife Division biologist at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And I'm going to be talking to you about piping plovers and least terns and their life history here in Connecticut. All right. So the objectives for today are going to be, again, going over life history, how we manage for these birds in Connecticut, and a little bit about how we monitor. Okay, so piping plovers, they're kind of a big deal. So they are a federally threatened species and have been since 1986. And they are a state threatened species since 1992. So piping plovers, there are 3 populations that make up the greater population of piping plovers. There's an Atlantic coast population, which is one that breeds specifically on the Atlantic coast. There's a Great Lakes population that breeds specifically along the shores of the Great Lakes. And there's the Northern Great Plains population, which nests on sandbars along major rivers like the Missouri River, the Platte River. And again, there is thought that they're somewhat insular in that they tend to kind of breed amongst each other and don't necessarily intermingle much, but we're still learning about what these birds do on the wintering ground. But piping plovers in Connecticut were once deemed a common summer visitor. So that indicates that, it was a fairly common thing to see on Connecticut shoreline. So these birds began to decline. And there are 3 major reasons. One is there was unregulated harvest for the hat making industry. There's shoreline development, houses, that sort of thing that are right up against, dunes. And there is human disturbance. Now, really, it's just 2 and 3 that continue today. There's no hunting season for piping plovers, so that's not really an issue anymore. But shoreline development and human disturbance are two that persist. So in 1986, when this bird was added to the federal endangered species list, there was only 553 pairs that bred along the entire Atlantic coast. So that's maritime Canada down to North Carolina. So this, some very smart people in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service kind of came up with, they thought that to recover this species, it would take 2,000 pairs along the Atlantic coast, and specifically 625 pairs just in New England. And those numbers would have to be consistent for 5 years or so for the Fish and Wildlife Service to deem this species to be recovered. Our recovery goal here in Connecticut is about 40 pairs, and we have an average of about 53 pairs since we began intensively monitoring for the species. So for those of you who don't know much about the Federal Endangered Species Act, the purpose of it is to protect and recover imperiled species and their ecosystems. So for that to happen, there needs to be kind of a plan, and there is a recovery plan for piping plovers, and this is pretty much like a cookbook for how to recover, because if you think about it, there's a lot of states involved in monitoring and protecting piping plovers. So this recovery plan helps us all keep our eye on the ball. So the Endangered Species Act prevents take is defined as harassing, hunting, shooting, wounding, killing, trapping, capturing, or collecting, or any attempt to do so of piping plovers or their nests. This act, unfortunately, fortunately, depending on your point of view, has limited authority on private property. And Connecticut DEP works with other state agencies, towns, private landowners, federal agencies, volunteers, academics. We work with a lot of people to try and recover this species. Okay, so piping plover and least tern habitat. In Connecticut, we've got about 80 miles of sandy beaches. And if you think about it, beaches are inherently narrow. In Connecticut, they are fragmented and they're highly developed. And if you've been to any of our beaches, you know that they're intensively utilized with many competing user groups. You have volleyball players, you have dog walkers, you have sandcastle builders. Everyone's there for different reason. So piping plover, talk a little bit about their breeding habitat. These birds arrive right about now. Actually, we say late March, but I believe that people saw them on our beaches in early March. They arrive back from their wintering areas. They overwinter in South Carolina, the Gulf Coast, and the Bahamas. And on their breeding habitats and on their wintering habitats, they prefer sandy beaches. So males and females have a little bit differing plumages. So the females tend to be fairly lighter colored. When you put the two together, if you put a breeding pair together, the female will appear more lighter in color, and the male will have a very heavy black collar around its neck, which you would think would make it pretty conspicuous when looking for it, but it's amazing how easily these birds blend right into the beach. As you can see, this big red oval here, that is a piping plover in the dune, which is sometimes difficult to see. So these birds will begin to nest in mid to late April. So their nest, it's not like other passerines that, like a robin will take grasses and create a nest, a proper nest. They'll weave those grasses together. Piping plovers, like other shorebirds, use just a depression in the sand. The sand is their nesting material. So the male will kind of kick a bit of a scrape in the sand, and the female will choose which scrape she likes the best. And she will then go and lay typically 4 eggs. And those eggs are very cryptically colored. The goal of that is to just kind of blend in with the sand. And if you've ever seen a piping plover nest, it's very difficult to pick out on a beach where there's lots of shells and whatnot. So incubation. Incubation is delayed until all 4 eggs are laid. So the female will lay an egg in consecutive days. And after that 4th egg is laid, then the pair begins full-time incubation. And incubation duties are shared by the pair. And those eggs will hatch in about 27 days. So once those eggs hatch, piping plover chicks they're precocial chicks, which means that once they hatch and dry off, they are up and running. They're kind of like horses like that, like once born, they're up and following their parents and learning the ways of the world. The chicks will stay with their parents throughout migration. So if they hatch in May, they're going to stick with those parents all the way to August or September when the parents migrate down to their wintering grounds. And we use this term fledge a lot, but fledging means when a bird is developed enough to fly. So these chicks will fledge in 28 days. And learning to fly, that fledge means sustained flight. So the birds will have to, they will have had to have been or be developed enough to sustain flight. Because as you watch chicks develop, they will do short little bursts of flying, stretching and using those muscles, but we're talking about sustained flight. So once those chicks hatch, like I said, they follow the parents around the beach and they spend a lot of time foraging the rack line. And they are concentrating on eating invertebrates, whatever's in the rack line. And I should perhaps define rack. Rack is that line of like flotsam, it's vegetation and critters that kind of are left on the beach as the tide rises or falls. So typically when you're on a beach, you'll see 3 distinct lines of rack. One will be the high tide, one will be the low tide, and one will be the middle and tide. Because that tide line is situated between the intertidal zone and the dunes, it's kind of a good halfway point for these chicks because they're so small. It's a halfway point for them to find food and start that development. And it's super important in those early first days of these chicks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to quickly talk about lease terns and their status. So lease terns and piping plovers are often lumped together because they nest in the same habitat. And they have very similar life histories. So when we manage for piping plovers, we're also managing for lease terns. The interior, so like piping plovers, there are different populations. There's an Atlantic coast population and there's an interior population. The Atlantic coast population is not federally listed, not included on the Federal Endangered Species Act, but the interior population, which nests on those sandbars and along the Great Lakes and that sort of thing, that population is federally listed. But lease terns are on our state endangered species list. They're threatened species and have been since 1992. These birds arrive later than piping plovers. So oftentimes, for those of you that will begin monitoring in April, you're going to monitor through April, then all of a sudden you're going to have lease terns showing up in beginning of May. And oftentimes, because they use the same nesting habitat, they are often communal nesters. So you'll find piping plover nests within least tern colonies. So least terns, they lay 1 to 3 eggs. Again, like the piping plover, they're cryptic eggs. Again, like the piping plover, their nesting material is just the sand. It's just a scrape in the sand. And again, those, I don't think I mentioned, but piping plover chicks are fairly cryptically colored as well. And you can see these least tern chicks are as well. They just look like sand. So least terns, which are, excuse me, unlike piping plovers, they have altricial chicks, which basically means they get a lot of care by their parents. So these chicks will be in the dunes and the parents will fly back and forth fishing for them and bringing fish back to them. So unlike piping plovers that are wandering the beach as chicks, these birds are going to be sticking to the dunes, just trying to avoid predation until they're developed enough to begin fishing on their own. So the thing about least terns, which I think is awesome, but some people don't, is that the parents are incredibly protective. And I'll show you a couple of pictures later on about how protective they are. But like I said, they're cryptically colored and they spend time in the dunes. Again, just trying to avoid predation. And in this case, gulls are a big predator of least tern chicks. So we're going to start talking a little bit about management here. So, and I'm going to call it a conservation challenge. Conservation challenge for one of them for piping plovers and least terns is predation. We experience predation on all beaches. It's a natural thing for the most part. I consider natural predators to be foxes and bobcats and coyotes and all the ones that I'm listing here. But then there's also an added pressure of not so natural predators. And I consider these to be raccoons, skunks, house cats, feral cats, and even dogs sometimes. And I consider those to be human subsidized predators. And that basically means predators that are attracted to areas because of the human presence. Things like garbage are going to draw in raccoons and skunks and whatnot. So, you know, what we don't want is we don't want this situation here on the picture on the right where you've got an area cordoned off for piping plovers nesting and you have a overflowing garbage can right next to it because that's just going to draw predators in. And in addition to drawing those predators in, garbage has that added issue of becoming an entanglement issue for wildlife in general. Another conservation challenge that you're going to see on the coast is dogs. Now, leashed dogs or unleashed dogs, they're all perceived as predators to shorebirds. You know, they're not going to, a piping plover is not going to see your dog as any different than a coyote or a fox. So most of our beaches have regulations about dogs on the beach, meaning that there are certain times where dogs are not allowed on the beach. Usually it's a swimming season, but unfortunately there's very little enforcement of that. So if you're going to be monitoring our beaches, you're going to see likely quite a bit about this. And unfortunately too, even trying to let people know that there's regulations about dogs, people often get very defensive about that. Another management challenge or conservation challenge, oh, excuse me, wrong slide. So how do we manage these birds in Connecticut, given those conservation challenges and the life history? So DEP has been intensively monitoring piping plovers in particular since 1984, and we monitor from Greenwich to Groton. So all statewide, and we acknowledge that there's lots of competition between recreation and nesting areas for these birds on these beaches. You know, you've got people trying to ATV on beaches. You have people that are trying to kayak, people that are trying to kite surf. Again, the beach is intensively utilized by many recreators. So our biggest tool in the toolbox for managing nesting shorebirds in Connecticut is, funny enough, fencing. So we use simple wooden stakes and string and specific signs indicating that piping plovers are present or that it's a bird nesting area. We start identifying the good areas of nesting, or the good nesting habitat on these beaches. We will identify them and we start cordoning off these areas at the beginning of April. So we call this string fencing or psychological fencing or stake and twine fencing. It's all the same. But this cordoning off these areas, it protects the birds from disturbance, from human disturbance in particular. So it keeps people from walking through their nesting areas and potentially stepping on nests or chicks. And it has the dual purpose of protecting people from inadvertently stepping on, these eggs or chicks. And most people that you talk to, no one wants to hurt, baby birds. So when we get pushback sometimes from people about having areas that are essentially closed to the public because of the nesting, we kind of point out that it protects you as well from inadvertently hurting them. This by cordoning off areas of the beach, it limits the disturbance to the breeding habitat itself, not only just the birds, but the breeding habitat itself. Because if you get areas where you have high traffic, high walking traffic, the birds will avoid that. So it keeps areas of the beach that are kind of disturbance free. And later in the season, when you have chicks and when people are on the beaches in higher numbers, it creates that buffer between the beachgoers and the birds. So how we manage piping plovers and least terns is dictated by their behaviors, and they are different species, and they do exhibit different behaviors. So piping plovers tend to spend a lot more time walking on the beach than flying, as least terns will. Piping plovers will escort you out of their nesting territory, and I'll explain a little bit more about that when we have our field training in April. Piping plovers will use a broken wing display if you get too close to their nests or their chicks. So many people see this behavior with killdeer, where and killdeer are a cousin of the piping plovers. They will feign that they have the adult will feign that they have a broken wing, because if you are a predator and you have your choice between a tiny chick and a meaty adult, of course you're going to go for the meaty adult that is, looking like it's injured. And the bird will flop around, just trying to get the attention of the predator. And once it gets that predator away from its eggs or its chicks, it will hop up and fly away. It's quite a smart behavior. So in Connecticut, we use a lot of nest exclosures, because I mentioned earlier that we have a lot of predation on our beaches, lots of natural predators out there. So in order to make sure that we have the highest nesting success, and that basically means we have chicks or eggs that persist to hatching, we will actually put fencing around individual nests. So when you're monitoring, you will likely see some exclosures. We don't use them on every nest. We tend to be judicious about it and factor in a bunch of different things, but essentially this fencing will keep out skunks and foxes, and we will put netting on top of that fencing, and therefore it keeps out gulls. Really, rats and weasels are kind of the only two things that seem to be able to get into that fencing. So if we, that can sometimes be a problem. And when I say that we're judicious about which nests we put them put them around, it's because it is a stressful experience for the birds. We do, acknowledge that, but our hatching success of our nests is actually 96% when we use fencing versus 33% when we don't. We typically put exclosures up after the 4th egg is laid, and they're fairly sizable. So when you see them, you'll see that they're pretty big, and typically the nest is right in the center of the exclosure. We bury the fencing down to discourage skunks from digging under. And like I mentioned before, we put bird netting on top to keep the gulls out. So after those chicks hatch, those exclosures are not recognized as, protective at all. Like I said, once those chicks hatch, they're up and running around with the parents. They don't return to the exclosure for any reason. Because these birds are all over the beach, they're highly susceptible to being stepped on, especially when you have chicks running around in July or June after school gets out and the beaches get really packed. So really susceptible to being stepped on or eaten until they're developed enough to fly away. So least terns, like I mentioned before, different bird, different behaviors. They tend to be flyers, not walkers. So they tend to fly in to the beach and fly out. They have kind of stubby little legs. They're not spending a lot of time walking around the dunes. So exclosures like we put around piping plover nests, those would really be just an impediment to these birds. So we don't use exclosures around least tern nests. String fencing is the primary tool for managing least terns. And again, those parents are pretty protective. So in a way, they do a great job of protecting their critters. So if you see this, you see tern coming straight at your head, you are too close to their chicks or their eggs. So if you see this, I would advocate stepping away and getting close to the water and backing up until the bird stops chasing you or dive bombing you. On some beaches, we might put up a large section of fence, and it doesn't really show that well in these pictures, but which will hopefully kind of keep out coyotes and skunks and whatnot. But it's a big effort, and sometimes we just don't have the materials or manpower to set up such a fence. So we don't always do that. So monitoring, which hopefully is why you all are attending. Why is it so important to us? It's kind of twofold. One is you're going to be collecting data for us. And while none of us are enforcement folks, it gives an enforcement-like presence. It means people will see that there are others out there caring about these birds and wondering why they're so special, that there's these people, looking at them and counting chicks and that sort of thing. Because you folks are going to be the eyes and ears for me. I'm only one person, and Rebecca Foster, who is our shorebird tech, is only one person, and we've got great partners. But again, there's a lot less of us than there are you and the public. So we really rely on your communication to let us know what's going on at these sites. And if you are someone who is interested in education, it certainly gives an opportunity to educate people, because a lot of times people, they may only get to the beach like 1 or 2 times a summer, and they may not even realize that, sandy beaches are habitat. It has its own ecosystem. They only see it as sand that they can, build sandcastles in, and don't necessarily think that it's nesting habitat. And our volunteer monitors also help us with protection during holiday weekends like Memorial Day and 4th of July weekends, and special events like fireworks events. Just again, having an extra presence out there on these beaches during those busy times during the summer helps protect these birds. And Connecticut, we meet our recovery goals most years. And I really attribute that to because we have such an enthusiastic, experienced, and expansive monitoring network of you folks and our conservation partners. It really does take a village to protect these birds and to protect them successfully. So you will learn more about this during our field training in April, but just a quick tutorial about how do we monitor for piping plovers. So when I say monitoring, I'm basically mean that, you know, we're walking the beach and we're looking for these birds. Monitoring is only done during good weather conditions, you know, times that are too hot or too cold or too windy are not great times to go looking for these birds because it's stressful for you and it's stressful for the birds. So, and I believe Scott will talk more about this later on. You're going to be making sure that our signs and our string fencing are up and adequate and haven't been vandalized or haven't been knocked over by the tides. You're going to be checking on the location and activity of piping plovers that you find, and you're going to be counting the number of chicks that you see with those parents. And a big thing is that we want you to stay outside of that string fenced area. Tend to call that, if people see you going in there, they'll think that it's okay. And we ourselves, you know, the biologists and our conservation partners, we try to stay out of those areas as well, because we want to serve as an example to the general public. And again, the more you do monitoring, the more you're going to pick up on the species specific behavior between plovers and terns. You know, is a piping plover escorting you down the beach? What does that mean? Is it using a broken wing display? Well, then it must mean that there's chicks or eggs close by. Is a least tern bombing you, dive bombing you? These are the things that you're going to experience. And the more you do monitoring, the more experience you get, and just the better you end up being at this. And oftentimes it's more enjoyable too, once you get the lay of the land and you can enjoy the behavior of the birds, because they really are fantastic. So here in Connecticut, we have a share the beach philosophy. We want people to respect our signage and our fenced off areas. So we will, when I'm monitoring, I'll remind people if they're getting too close to our string fencing to maybe back off. If they have a dog with them, maybe remind them that dogs aren't allowed on the beach, on that particular beach, if that indeed are the regulations. I'm going to talk about the birds positively, because we want people to get excited about the birds, and we don't want to leave people with a negative impression of these birds. And often just the takeaway message that I try and leave with people is that all these birds need is just a little bit of time and space to raise their young, which I think for people that are family oriented resonates with them, because that's really all we're trying to do too as parents. So Corey, I don't know if I have time for questions or if I should just jump right into being a good witness. I don't know if you have an opinion.
I think we could take maybe 3 questions, and then we
Okay.
can jump into being a good witness.
Okay.
I've muted everybody, but if somebody has a question, if you want to just unmute yourself and ask, I think we've got a small enough number of people that would be fine. Okay, it doesn't appear
Sweet.
that we have any questions, so I would say, why don't you go right into the being a good witness?
Sounds good. I was hoping that we would be able to have our law enforcement, DEP's law enforcement folks here today, but I don't think they were able to make it. So I'm just going to go over their portion. So because we are monitoring for a species that is protected in Connecticut, and protection means that there are laws and regulations pertaining to protecting them. So so while you're out monitoring, you're going to see all a whole spectrum of human behavior. And sometimes there's going to be some really flagrant, dangerous behavior towards those birds. And if you see that, we want to encourage you to call our DEP's Conservation Enforcement Police force. So we call them ENCON for short, Environmental Conservation Police Officers. So all of this information will be included in your volunteer packets. So you don't necessarily need to be scribbling notes here, but I'd like to remind you of a few things when it comes to being a good witness, because none of us are law enforcement, but what we want to do is make sure we collect information and data that we can give to our law enforcement folks should there be a situation where a piping plover is killed or chicks are killed. So first and foremost, if you're out there on the beach and you see something happen, do not place yourself in a dangerous situation. Again, I can't stress enough, we are not law enforcement. So if you are in danger, please call 911 first. Your safety is number one. If you are in a safe area, if you feel safe and you suspect that a person may be responsible for destroying or harassing adult piping plovers, nests, and or chicks, we encourage you to contact our ENCON police. And this number here, the 424-3333, is puts you right through to their dispatch, their emergency dispatch folks. So while you're there, included in that information packet is going to be an incident observation report, and it's basically going to ask you questions and have you fill out kind of just the facts, and we can provide that to our law enforcement folks when they arrive. When you get home, please send me an email and just to give me a heads up as to what the issue was and if it was or was not resolved. Oftentimes, law enforcement cases, it's not quickly solved, so or quickly resolved. So just letting me know that there's an issue so that I can follow up with ENCON is very much appreciated. This is the incident observation form. Again, it'll be in your information packet, and make sure you have a copy of it with you when you do your monitoring. So I just want to talk about being a good witness. It really is just being observant and taking notes. So things like if there was a vehicle involved, or if you saw this person exit a vehicle, if you can note the color, make, model, license plate, that sort of thing of the vehicle. Again, I don't want you approaching people. I don't want you putting yourself in danger, but if you can easily see this, that's very helpful. The description of the people, just their general description, sex, height, weight, length of hair, clothes, etc. When did this happen? The date and the time of day. That can all be important later on. The locations and distances, be able to describe the area, like where you were, where you thought that where the incident happened. If you can provide such details as like the individual walked within 5 feet of an area that's closed, and then proceeded to just walk right into the closed area and grab the bird. That's helpful. It provides those details. What are the weather conditions? That can be very important because it kind of states to you the visibility of the day. If we report something and someone says, no way, it was completely foggy, no one could have seen that far, that sort of thing, just gives us a indication of what the conditions were at the time of the incident. Do a description of what actually happened, and just, longhand, just a narrative is helpful, and there is space on that form for you to provide that. And certainly don't disturb the crime scene. If you saw this happen, don't walk into the string fencing. Don't even walk up to the string fencing, because footprints and that sort of thing are very important to law enforcement. So, and please never take a carcass or eggs or any of that home with you, those really are, the authority must be given by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to us at the state to collect those birds. They're federally protected birds, so no one without authority should have them in hand, essentially. So not that I think that this is going to happen to everyone, but should a conflict or a hostile situation arise, because people are unpredictable, I would advocate that you try and diffuse the situation by identifying yourself as a volunteer piping plover monitor or shorebird monitor. Explain that you're just observing the birds and collecting data for us. If people have questions or want to talk to someone, they can call me, and my phone number is here. My phone number will be everywhere. You'll get badges. My phone number will be on the badges. It's in your paperwork. Just give that person my number. So as a monitor, again, we're not law enforcement. All we can do is relay beach regulation information, such as closed or open areas, and what dogs are or are not permitted to do during the nesting season. Never attempt to physically confront anyone, verbally give any commands, or demand personal information from anyone. That tends to really kind of up the ante and really inflame things. So we're not looking to be pushovers, but we just don't want people to end up in situations that are unpleasant. Okay, so that was the end of my being a good witness spiel.
So we can pause here for another moment and take questions. If folks have questions about either what Laura shared about plovers and leash turns or about being a good witness. Okay, well, if not, I think we'll move on. So Laura, if you can
sorry, I do have a question.
Oh, go ahead, go for it.
Yeah, so on the beach, in a nice summer day, people are up there and they may be drinking. So what if we see something and we approach the person and say, "Oh, no, we need you to step away from the stringed area," for example, and they become belligerent? What would be the proper response to that?
Certainly if someone's drinking, that just kind of ups the unpredictability aspect of human behavior. The best you can do is let them know. If they're being belligerent, then I would say walk away and just note in the notes that you're going to be taking as you do your monitoring the situation. If they're outside the string fencing, then in theory, they're not doing anything wrong. So it's not like I would advocate you call the cops, or just noting it in your notes is helpful. And I know it doesn't necessarily seem like it's an effective thing, but at the end of the season, when I get everyone's notes, it helps me understand like the level of like human disturbance that's going on in these areas. Also that, yeah, people are right up against the fencing and they're drinking and it's a problem. And that gives me an opportunity to talk to our law enforcement folks so that maybe they can up their patrols at this site. So oftentimes you're going to be reporting things and you're not necessarily going to see that resolution right away. It just helps justify me getting that resolution later on. So did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
As well as, okay.
Yep.
Hi, good morning. I have a question too.
Sure.
Do all Connecticut state beaches, public beaches, have leash laws?
So in your volunteer packet is going to be information on the rules of certain beaches, like the beaches where the birds are breeding. We'll have information about like whether dogs are allowed or not, whether they need to be unleashed, or any of that is located in your volunteer packet. And it also has the dog warden phone number. So oftentimes, if you see dogs off leash or dogs that are on beaches and they shouldn't be, giving a call to the dog warden is helpful. And I know, again, it ends up being where you're often not going to get a resolution quickly. But if you're calling the dog warden and the person that's volunteering later in the afternoon after you is calling the dog warden, it sets up, it shows that there's a need for more enforcement on that beach. So, so again, I encourage you to call the dog warden if you're seeing dogs on beaches where they shouldn't be. But just understand they're not likely to run over and deal with it right away. But it again kind of shows that there's a need.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Laura, one question that's in the chat is how far away are we hoping to keep people from the fencing in general? I think, the first part of that answer is we certainly don't want people in the fencing. So if you see somebody in the fencing, we definitely want you to ask them to, exit the fencing. And if they don't exit the fencing, that is when you start collecting Be a Good Witness information and, calling NCON and letting them, know that this is occurring. Laura, do you want to answer the sort of question about if somebody say set up directly adjacent to the fencing, but not in the fencing, what should volunteers do?
So when we put the string fencing up, oftentimes we're trying to create like that buffer, like I mentioned earlier. So that buffer where the birds can still relax and do their incubation and whatnot, knowing that, that the public is kind of outside the string fencing. So we tend to try and fence off a good buffer so that even if people are right up against the string fencing, hopefully the birds will settle down and do what they need to do. That said, some of our beaches are so narrow that even when we put our string fencing up and we'll string fence kind of right down to the high tide mark, even that isn't going to be enough to get that bird to calm down. So if people are setting up shop right in front of string fencing on a narrow beach where the bird's real jumpy and the bird keeps jumping up off its nest every time someone walks by, or is clearly reacting to the people that are set up right in front of the fencing, I would ask people if they wouldn't mind moving away. A lot of it depends on understanding the bird's behavior and how that bird is reacting to the public around it. So that's not always going to be an easy thing when you're new, but I tend to, if people are set up right in front of a nest, I ask them if they can move down to give that bird a little bit of breathing space so it won't be so stressed out. That said, many times people are like, no, I've got my umbrella up, I'm not moving. And the best you can do is just request that they move. But hopefully there's enough string fencing there for that bird to eventually feel safe enough to calm down.
Okay, well, I think we will move on at this point. So Laura, if you can take down your presentation, I'll pop mine back up. So, there are 4, maybe 5 bird species that we are asking you all to monitor. Piping plover and least terns, you heard about from Laura. I'm going to talk a bit about American oystercatcher, which is another species that you are likely to encounter out on the beaches. And then the 2 other species that you might encounter would be the common tern, which typically nests on offshore islands, but every now and then, if there's a pretty good sized least tern colony set up, we'll get some common terns nesting with the least terns. You'll recognize them because they are bigger than the least terns. They're kind of about twice the size, and they have an orange bill, and they sound a bit different too. So the least terns go kia, kia. Or wait, no, least terns go kee-kitty, kee-kitty, kee-kitty. And then the common terns go kia, kia. So you'll learn the difference by sound. And then the one other species that it's possible people might encounter would be black skimmer. And black skimmer is we've only had them nesting at one site in Connecticut the last couple of years, and their lower jaw is bigger than their upper jaw, so that it makes them pretty recognizable. So those are the species that you might encounter when you're out monitoring. So I'm going to just share my screen and tell you guys a little bit more about American oystercatcher, which most of the beaches that have nesting piping plovers also have nesting American oystercatchers. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so American oystercatchers are a state threatened bird species, so they're in the same category as least tern, which is also state threatened. The global population size for American oystercatcher is roughly about 10,000 individuals, and they, nest from the Gulf Coast, to Connecticut, Massachusetts, and then overwinter in Central America, the Southern United States, Caribbean islands. In Connecticut, we had 79 breeding pairs last year and 21 non-breeding pairs. By non-breeding pairs, that means that we never had official, we weren't able to sort of confirm that they were breeding. So some of those might have been breeding, and we just were never able to locate a nest, or some of them may be a young pair that is kind of scoping out territories, but hasn't started actually breeding. And the 79 breeding pairs had a productivity of 0.78 fledglings per pair. So they produced 62 fledglings last year. Trying to advance my screen. Here we go. Similar to piping plovers, American oystercatchers arrive in March. And I think we had our first oystercatchers showing up in Connecticut last week. These birds will start nesting in early April and nest through August. And similar to plovers, they are territorial. So you'll have, maybe one pair of birds every 200 or 300 feet along a stretch of beach. They incubate their eggs for roughly 24 to 29 days, and incubation is conducted by both parents. Their chicks are semi-precocial, which basically means that they do have downy feathers when they hatch out of their eggs. And within a couple hours, just like the piping plover, they are mobile, which means that the chicks can be seen both within or outside of the string fence areas. But unlike piping plovers, they do need to be fed by their parents. From the first picture, you can see that an adult American oystercatcher has a very long bill that it uses for breaking open mussel and oyster shells. And it takes quite a while for the chicks to actually grow a full-size bill, and then even longer for the chicks to be able to learn how to use their bill to sort of crack open various mollusk shells. So it takes them about 35 days to learn how to fly, but then fledglings will stay with their parents for 6 months easily, some of them up to a year before they become fully independent. With oystercatchers, and this is true for plovers too, if chicks are lost or a nest is lost, oystercatchers will re-nest. Typically, definitely at least one time, sometimes 2 or 3 times. So they will continue to try to nest until the sort of breeding season comes to a close. Their chicks are camouflaged, as are their nests. So Laura showed a few pictures of plover nests. This is what an oystercatcher nest looks like. You can sort of see there isn't really any structure to the nest. The eggs are right there on the sand. These are chicks that literally, hatched, sometime within the last 24 hours. You can see there's 3 of them there. So they are fairly camouflaged, similar to the plovers. And this is what the chicks look like when they sort of reach the fledgling stage. So the bird in the center is an adult bird. You can see it has a fully orange bill, but then the bird on the left and the bird on the right are fledglings. So those are birds that, at this point are flying, but you can see that their bills maybe aren't quite as long as the adult, and they also have this black tip. So in the sort of latter half of the breeding season, this is kind of helpful to, if you look at your oystercatcher's bills, it will help you sort of determine if they are birds that were born this year or birds that are, over a year old. Oystercatchers, like I said, they nest on a lot of the same beaches as our piping plovers and are protected by the string fencing and signage that the state of Connecticut deploys. They don't need exclosures. That isn't an effective tool for oystercatchers. But they also nest on islands, and on islands with high visitation, we'll put string fencing up on those islands as well. So just examples would be a Kokini Island in Westbrook, and then Westport, and then Nunkatizik Island in Westbrook are two islands that do get fencing for the number of oyster catchers that do show up, and the number of visitors to those areas. Some of our major nesting areas in Connecticut are Kokini Island and the Norwalk Islands, the Westbrook Barrier Islands, which include Minnekatizik, Duck, and Salt Island. And then there's a pretty large concentration of oyster catchers at Sandy Point Island, which is mostly in Rhode Island, but there's one little section of it that is in Connecticut. But you can see that the oyster catchers really are using the entire coast from Greenwich to Stonington. As I mentioned, we had 100 pairs in 2022. 79 of those pairs were confirmed breeders, and those birds produced 62 fledglings for a productivity of 0.78. And this, our 10-year average in Connecticut is 0.74. So last year was a good year for American oyster catchers. And one thing I'll note is that the sort of recommended oyster catcher productivity rate for recovery of the species is 0.5. So Connecticut typically has a higher productivity than a lot of the other states along the flyway. So we are actually really we are producing a lot of oyster catchers in Connecticut, and our population size continues to grow every year. And, you know, hopefully some of those birds are sort of expanding to neighboring states as well. The chicks and nests that we do lose, predation is the biggest issue that these birds face, but also severe coastal storms and flooding are a challenge for the species. There is, you know, we do have a lot of birds that nest out on our offshore islands, and the oyster catchers, some of them will nest on fairly large islands that, you know, maybe have trees in the center, but some of them will nest on little, you know, just a couple of rocks that happen to stay above the high tide, you know, during the full moon cycle. And, you know, so they are pretty adaptable in terms of sort of the size of islands that they will use or the substrate. Some of them will nest on beaches, some of them will nest on rocky areas. So they are fairly flexible. And most of about 79% of the population does tend to nest on the offshore islands. The islands typically have less human disturbance and less predation, so the birds typically have higher productivity on the islands than they do on the mainlands. And you can see that on this graph. The blue is the productivity on islands, while the green is the productivity on the beaches. Beaches in 2022, we had 16 pairs on the beaches, 21% of the population. And their productivity on the beaches on the mainland sites can be somewhat variable. You can sort of see that it's fluctuated a good amount over the years. Last year's productivity on the mainland was 0.5, which is up from 0.15 the year before. One thing that I'll point out from this graph is you can actually see that in 2020, the mainland sites had higher productivity than the island sites. And the reasoning for that was, you know, these birds are really impacted by human disturbance. And in 2020, you know, during the pandemic, there were certain beaches that were closed, you know, to all visitation, or closed to, you know, everybody except local residents. And that actually reduced the amount of activity at those beaches. And so some of our oyster catchers that normally aren't productive at mainland sites were actually able to produce young that year. So that was why we had a lot higher productivity in 2020 on the mainland sites. One other cool thing about our oyster catchers, and this actually makes them a little bit easier to keep track of, is that a lot of them are banded at this point. Audubon, Connecticut started banding American oyster catchers in 2018 and have been banding them steadily since then. We've got 62 oyster catchers that are banded at this point, and that includes 45 adults, or 28% of the Connecticut breeding population. And then we've also banded 17 fledglings in the past, you know, over the last couple of years. Last year in 2022, we banded 13 fledglings that fledged from Connecticut beaches, and then 3 additional fledglings that maybe were moving south during migration. We were able to catch and put a band on. The cool thing about these bands is that they are field readable. So if you have binoculars, a viewing scope, or a camera with a really good zoom lens, you can actually read the bands. Typically they're in a triangle pattern, so they'll have a letter on the top and then a number below the letter. So you can see this fledgling here is N62. And what that means is that you can, if say at your banding, if you are monitoring at, say, Milford Point, there are typically 3 or 4 pairs of oyster catchers there, and a couple of them will have bands, and then you'll be able to identify that individual bird, which is cool. It makes it easier for you to sort of monitor individual pairs, because you'll, maybe one of those birds actually has a band, and you can sort of tell that is definitely that pair when you are monitoring. The other cool thing is that you can report your oyster catcher bands. So you can report them when you are submitting your data to the Audubon Alliance, but you can also go to AAfCW, which stands for American Oyster Catcher Working Group.org, and you can actually report oyster catcher bands there as well. They kind of have the site set up so that you can track your oyster catchers, so if you are going to your site and there's oyster catchers that are there regularly, you can sort of maybe know, hey, these birds seem to be breeding at this particular site. When you report them to the working group. But if you see additional banded birds coming through during sort of spring or fall migration, you can add those sightings as well, and it will tell you it will tell you for each bird that you report, where that bird was originally banded, and I think it may also tell you if that bird, where that bird has been seen over the course of its lifespan since it was banded. We have learned a lot about the movement of oyster catchers during the season, as well as about mate and site fidelity from banding oyster catchers. Some things we've learned, that there are 3 main staging areas in Connecticut, which are Kokini Island, Milford Point, and then also Monocatezic Island. And that 15 of the Connecticut banded birds that we have actually changed their breeding site, changed their mate, or they've done both over the past 4 seasons. So we used to think that a pair of birds would come back to the exact same spot and continue, breed there every single year, but we're realizing that actually some of our birds are switching mates and some of our birds are switching sites. So there is a little bit more variability in nesting location and nesting and pairs than we thought there was. The staging areas that I mentioned, one thing we are learning is that they may sort of their location may be a kind of part, nearness to breeding areas, and then sort of part places where birds can sort of stop during migration. That's sort of illustrated by, we had a bird that was banded at Milford Point in 2020. It was resighted in South Carolina in I think the beginning of the breeding season, May of 2022. Then it came to Connecticut in July, and it staged with the flock at Milford Point before returning to North Carolina at the end of the month. So this was a fairly young bird, a 2-year-old bird, so not really at the point of breeding yet, but it went to Milford Point, and sort of hung out there for a period of time, sort of before it, again migrated south. So really neat stuff that we are learning about oyster catchers. So we totally ask everyone to keep an eye out for banded oyster catchers. The yellow is sort of indicative of a bird that was banded in, I believe, Connecticut or Rhode Island, I think. Beth, you can jump on and correct me if I'm wrong there. But, we also see birds with red bands. Those are birds that were banded in Georgia, but we get other colors as well. So they can come in a variety of different colors. So if you see a oyster catcher with bands, try to get a good look, see if you can record the number, and then either submit that information to the Alliance, or you can go ahead and submit it to the Oyster Catcher Working Group. Okay, I think I am done. Does anybody have any questions about oyster catchers? And we see we've got Patrick Cummins, who's the Executive Director of Connecticut Audubon Society, has just joined us. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you.
Corey, there is a question in the chat about the referring to the graph that you showed with the beach nesting and island nesting birds, and what happened in 2017 and 2018 for the beach nesting birds, the lower number.
That's so I'm Beth, definitely jump in if you are there and have a better answer, but I'm just going to assume that those were years where we had a lot of productivity, a lot of predation, a lot of disturbance on the mainland, and our mainland sites just did not do well.
Yeah, hi Corey, this is Beth. So yeah, you're correct. Those were years where predation was, much higher than previous years, and there was, a lot more human disturbance on the mainland than there are on the islands. So the productivity tends to always be lower on our mainland sites than it is on our islands.
Thanks, Beth. Okay, any other questions at this point? Okay, not hearing any, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pass it over to Scott, who is going to kind of give you the lowdown on how to monitor, how to do your schedule, how to submit your data. Scott has been our volunteer coordinator for the Audubon Alliance for like 12 years now. Scott, is that right?
Yeah, this is what for us, 13?
Something like
Year
that.
12 or year 12, yeah, I don't know, but since the beginning.
Okay, well, take it away.
Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm glad to have new people with us again this year. And as Corey said, I'm the volunteer coordinator of the Audubon Alliance for Coastal Waterbirds, and I have been now since the beginning. Started this working for National Audubon and Connecticut Audubon Society, both at different times while I was in college, and now, or subsequently moved on to the Roger Tory Peterson Institute of Natural History. And now I do this as a freelance contractor through my business, Scott Krupash Photography. So I'm glad to still be with all of my colleagues and friends and all of you. And I'll go through some of the volunteer monitoring tactics, techniques, protocols, and all the rest. And from that point, I'll cover a little bit of what Corey and Laura may have touched on, and we'll wrap up with some more questions. So your volunteer responsibilities, as we've discussed somewhat so far, you're going to be going out and observing and collecting data for piping plovers, American oyster catchers, least terns, and common terns. Those are the 4 focal species. Now, we may be, again, at times seeing something like nesting black skimmers at one of our beaches and observing a lot of other, birds along the way. But for our part, those are the 4 focal species that we'll mostly be talking about. You're going to visit your beaches at least monthly to a few times a week. And at some sites, this might be walking, 100 feet from your car to just a small sandy beach area, like at Short Beach in Stratford, or if you're walking at Bluff Point, it might be several miles. You're going to report problems or disturbances, which include abandoned nests, loose dogs, excessive trash, visitation levels, if there's a lot of people, signs of predators, direct threats, or takes that Laura discussed. You're going to educate beachgoers, but keep in mind this will be with kindness about young and nests, about dog leash laws, not leaving trash and giving birds a space. Always, again, positive, non-confrontational, remembering we're just there to educate and help or move on if people are giving us a problem. And we're going to ask if you can assist with special events, whether it's string fencing and signage, the piping plover statewide census of checking every beach in Connecticut in June, fireworks displays in July, beach cleanups at different times, distributing literature on the beach, and that sort of thing. And you can see on the right there, we have a little piping plover in the rack line. That's an adult that is in the rack line, along with a lot of people in the background just enjoying their beach activities in the summer. But you can see how, again, they get lost very easily there. And in that picture, we have an oyster catcher sitting on a nest. And again, this is all taken, all the photos that I've taken and I'll show you here are from our beaches for the most part, and are taken usually when I'm standing along the water line, which is where we all want to be. And volunteer conduct is very important because we want to make sure that we're professional in our behavior and our dress and appearance, always wearing a shirt with our Connecticut DEEP badge at all times. You're going to file the liability form, which we will give out in the informational packet. That can be dropped off or scanned back. While volunteering, we're going to make sure that we're not partaking in things like drinking or smoking, swimming or sunbathing, fishing. That all might be, again, fine on your time, but if you're volunteering, we want to make sure that we keep it professional and focused on monitoring the birds. because our performance will affect the public perception of wildlife management, endangered species, and conservation on the whole, apart from the daily operations of the AAfCW. And as Laura said, if you have rude people, just have a good day, move on, keep going, because that social distancing and private space are all the more important, even though we're largely removed from the height of the pandemic now. Some people still are wanting to have a lot more space. Other people are still very stressed or agitated in general. It's been a hard few years. We just want to make sure that we don't bother them too much. We just want to be, again, informational, educational, positive. And if that's not that, keep it moving. So for monitoring, we're going to want to make sure that we will be going out if there's only positive, good, bright, sunny, nice days. We don't want to be out in the snow or the rain, or if there's a threat of thunderstorms at the beach. We want to stay home if it's cooler than 50 degrees or hotter than 90 degrees, or if it's very windy to be noted as significant. If you're getting pushed over by it, you're having a hard time breathing, there's sand blowing on you, that sort of thing, you're going to know that it's probably too windy, because all of that can threaten our birds, because we're keeping in mind that we want to be, again, monitoring and helping them, not also taking them off the nest when it's inclement weather or making their lives harder. And we're always want to bring our deep badge, binoculars, or spotting scope, phone and notebook, papers like Laura said, outreach materials. Keep in mind that you might want to have sunblock, water, insect repellent, backpack or a bag, hats, jacket, and gloves, depending on the time of year and the weather. Cameras with a long zoom or a longer lens can be helpful too. And to always wear strong sneakers or boots. And if you are ill or injured, please do just let me know and postpone it or cancel it. That's a good view of a day not to be at the beach. That was taken from my car several years ago at Long Beach. And that's a good time in the parking lot. I was in the parking lot, so we're good. But it's a good time to leave. As would this be. This was a piping plover in the snow, and considering the forecast for this week, I might be trying to take some of those pictures Tuesday or Wednesday. So monitoring procedures. We want to check our electronic data entry form that you'll find at ctwaterbirds.blogspot.com for what is required. You'll be able to see that you can go through and enter one species at a time. You're going to enter the beginning and end time of your monitoring with your name, date, and where you were, the species that you observed, the age of the birds, their breeding status, weather, tide, people, all that sort of thing. When you get to the beach, you want to walk, again, where Laura said, between the rack line and the water line, ideally kind of by that water, keeping in the wet sand. You're going to scan the beach from afar, especially keep an eye out for piping plovers. And this avoids disturbing them or putting them into an agitated state, and ideally avoids going near nests. You never want to enter the string fencing again for any reason. Again, not for the birds. If you see some trash, to get somebody out, for a predator or a picture, or any reason. And keep just yourself at all times, if possible, by that area of wet sand and by the water, and not going into the dune or not going up to the nests. When we have an exposure over nests, it will have had a complete nest of 4 eggs. So we know that for piping plovers. When we get to terns, if there's tern colonies, you can simply count the number of terns that are to appear sitting on nest within the colony. You don't need to count the nest themselves or see the eggs. And this is an example of, again, where you want to be. I am by the water. This couple is walking between the rack line and me. You can see the rack line is by their knees, and that's a piping plover exposure. And you can see the little piping plover right in the middle, right there, sitting on the nest. So they're not in too bad of a spot because they're not disturbing it. We just want to see that bird on the nest. And if you see it from afar when you're standing by the water, that's all you really need to know. Monitoring procedures continued. You're going to want to record focal species behavior and the breeding status. If they're a pair, if they're foraging, if they're on the nest like that, if there's a couple chicks, if they're fighting over territory. Adult piping plovers might lead you away from the nest, like Laura explained and showed you, with displays and alarm calls and more. So you're going to want to slowly, quietly, and safely exit this area and stay along the water. Terns are going to dive bomb you, scream at you. Again, follow that same kind of procedure. You're going to want to just, in general, minimize the time around nests and eggs, because they're susceptible to that cold, to that heat, to being, away from their parents, and to have predators come up to them all the more readily. And that, you know, in general, cameras and phones help a lot because we can take more media, we can record things, but just keep in mind, especially now, some people do not want to have a phone put in their face or a camera put in their face. And certainly the birds don't, and we don't want to go too close to their nest either. But just use it judiciously and intelligently. And again, there's an example of just how tiny a new piping plover chick can be. You can see grains of sand on it and just the size comparison. They're just hiding right there among the shells, blending in perfectly. And that's an example of a bird, a piping plover adult, that is hollering and screaming and saying, you know, hey, over here, look at me, because it doesn't want you to go near its nest and it doesn't want you to go by any young. So as I said, you don't want to count the eggs for them or turn nest. We just want to know that the nest is there. So if you find that new nest, or if you see a bird doing that you haven't seen before, or it's outside of the fencing especially, you don't want to mark it or approach it, but you do want to tell AAfCW and Laura and Rebecca directly via email while you describe the landmarks at the location. You don't want to put anything there again, because it's going to lead predators there, it'll lead people there. You just want to make notes about what it looks like, or take a picture again from afar. Exposed nest for piping plovers will be complete with the 4 eggs, and they can be viewed like I just showed you. The nest is abandoned or destroyed by tides or predators, which will happen more than you might expect, unfortunately. Just tell AAfCW and CTD directly via email as soon as you can. And just always note predator tracks if you see them, if you're skilled at that, or if it's something subtle like tracks like that, or if it's something really obvious like fish crows sitting on the exposure like that, a red fox hopping around, a cat. That's a cat with a cottontail. So if a cat can have a cottontail like that, people sometimes say, oh, well, the cats or the dogs, they won't really bother the birds. They will most certainly bother the birds. The birds are not too big for them. They're not too fast. They'll grab whatever they can grab. And sometimes a lot of our beaches are right near, you know, neighborhoods with people and homes, and that's what you get. And you might just see a red fox like that hidden in the grass in the dune or somewhere in that kind of way. Just note that and please let us know. We do have a lot of foxes on our beaches. For monitoring, bird safety is paramount and data is secondary. Please, please, please just remember that we want to observe and note the birds, but that we want to make sure they're safe more than anything. We do not need the extra data. If you're not sure about, oh, I don't know if I saw the other adult of that bird, don't go into the dunes. If you're not sure if they have a nest, just let us know that. That's totally fine. You don't have to go actually check the nest. We can be a big disturbance, and we have to maintain our distance as well. Laura has gone over a lot of what you do if you see someone who might be destroying or harassing nests or chicks, and follow those good witness guidelines and call CT Deep NCON police, and so it'll be on your phone number sheet. And you want to have the observation form with you in case anything does happen, to fill out that. And you're going to let us know ASAP as well. But we're not law enforcement. We're just there to educate and observe, and to relay beach information, beach ordinances in friendly and positive ways. And if anything comes up, just have a good day, keep it moving. And I cannot repeat that enough, because it's very important. And again, there's a piping plover at Sandy Morse Points in West Haven, just very subtle, hidden adult. While there's folks who are coming up from fishing, there are always people on the beach. There's a lot of times very narrow corridors like this. So you have to keep that in mind as well. We talked about banded birds, and that's a 5E pink flagged banded piping plover that was at West Haven as well. This is a N14 banded American oyster catcher. That's a really cropped photo. Again, you can tell them by the water. This is a very long lens. It cropped the photo substantially. It's just enough to get information to be able to read the band, and that's it. Monitoring will take place from August 1st to August 3rd, or excuse me, April 1st to August 31st. That's the official side. Our staff will be monitoring basically from February to October. We're already outside to keep an eye on things. Some of our past monitors go out and do monitoring on their own and check the beaches out because they're excited earlier in the year. But our greatest need is the times of busiest beach traffic, which are weekends, holidays, warm beach weather once school ends and the kids are out. You know, Memorial Day weekend is crazy times at the beach. 4th of July, you can see something like that on the photo there. That's Milford Point, looking at Milford with an enormous amount of people and parties and that sort of thing. So there's just a lot of people at the beach, and that's when we need more of us at the beach. And you're going to sign up for everything, as you probably already have, at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. And you're going to sign up for a schedule as well. I'm going to list out the sites in a moment, but you're going to request your site or sites if there's a couple, say in Stratford. If you want to go to Long Beach and Short Beach, that's fine. You're going to let me know your requested schedule, whether that's a date. I want to go on May 5th and July 6th and so forth like that, or every, Wednesday afternoon at 5 p.m. You don't have to be absolutely specific on the times. AM or PM is okay. And some beaches require, such as Griswold Point, you to monitor the tides to be able to access them at low tides. And low tides in general are a good time to be there, especially at sites that have narrow corridors of walking, so you're not too close to the birds. But if you could please submit your schedules by April 1st, that would be fantastic. And if you need to cancel a session, which happens often, as you can imagine, because of weather, personal conflicts, just email ctwaterbirds@gmail.com as soon as you can. Data submission will be through the online data submission form on the AAfCW blog, which is ctwaterbirds.blogspot.com. It's in the upper right-hand column under important documents when you view it on the computer. You won't be able to see that column on the phone, probably in a phone browser, but if you're on a computer, you can see it all. If you enter all the required fields, but you leave whatever blank if you need, such as early in the season, we're not going to have young birds, of course, so you just don't put anything, then it'll work just fine. More documents and pertinent information are there as well, such as the informational packet, everything on dog laws, identification forms, and a lot more. If you go out on your own time and you find shorebirds, terns, and long-legged waders when you're going to the beach to see your friend, when you're at your house by a pond and that sort of thing, you want to share that too, you can always do so by putting it into eBird, which is a terrific database, and sharing that with us at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. And in general, please submit your data as soon as possible when you return from the beach. The faster we have the information, the more important it is to us and the more relevant and helpful. If we know about something, if we have your information, whether it's a specific problem or just daily, typical, everything's great data, knowing that is really important on a day-to-day basis for us and distributing staff and seeing how things are and keeping up with our birds across the state. And there you have some 7 American oyster catchers flying by in the middle of the summer. Those are birds who, as Corey mentioned earlier, birds that don't nest, whether there's pairs that don't nest or birds that have nests that fail and they give up for the season, they kind of flock together. And that was a group of 7 flying by the moon in the middle of the summer. And again, you're going to, if you have other birds, like this is stilt sandpiper, this is a royal tern, this is a green heron. If you have other birds of these families like this and you want to share that with us independently through eBird, please do. The monitoring locations are priority beaches in Long Beach and Stratford, Milford Point in Milford, Sandy Morse Points in West Haven, and Bluff Point in Groton. Those have the highest concentrations of birds and the highest concentrations of people. In particular, West Haven has been incredible in the last couple of years. Milford Point has had a lot. Long Beach has had some predator issues. The East has been a little quieter with birds, but every year changes because tides change the structure of the beach, predator levels change, people change, behavior changes. There can be very specific storm events, as may happen throughout the spring, that alter our bird distribution. Other beaches include Griswold Point in Old Lyme, Hammonasset Beach State Park in Madison, Short Beach in Stratford, Pleasure Beach in Bridgeport, Campo Beach in Westport, and Silver Sand State Park in Milford, plus Sherwood Island State Park in Westport, Russian Beach in Stratford, neighboring Milford and West Haven beaches, which can occasionally have a piping plover or two, and same for Waterford Town Beach. The offshore islands and other local beaches and marshes are often monitored by our staff. But if, for example, you live directly across from, an island that you're always at and doing your own thing there, we're not going to have people, we're not going to schedule people at places like that. But if you are there, let us know and we'll figure that out. And here's just a quick overview of the beaches again. That's Bluff Point and Waterford. There's Griswold Point, a little bit off the water there. Hammonasset, you would be monitoring at the public beach, which is on the left of this image, not the natural area preserve, that's closed, but the public beach areas. Silver Sands, I skipped over that, yeah. West Haven, there's Sandy Point, and sometimes we have other beaches nearby. Silver Sand State Park in Milford, and sometimes occasionally maybe a piping plover might be on Fort Trumbull Beach and some of those other beaches. We have Milford Point down to Shore Beach and Stratford, around to Russian Beach, which really doesn't typically have any, but we need to keep an eye on. Long Beach and Pleasure Beach and Bridgeport always have some birds. Sherwood Island State Park can be up and down. Compo Beach in the past few years has had birds as well. So you're going to have a badge, and before the pandemic, we would have a lot of these sessions in person. Now we've done this and it's worked really great, but you'll be able to, again, get all the paperwork electronically and other things like this for your badge and that sort of thing you can pick up at the Connecticut Audubon Society Coastal Center in Milford at those hours, and the Roger Torrey Peterson Estuary Center in Old Lyme. Or if you join us for field training in West Haven next month on April 15th at 10 to 12, you'll be able to hand in your paperwork. You can get a badge. You can talk to us. That's a really good thing to attend if you can. And there are the sites that for those, Old Lyme to Milford and West Haven. If there is someone who lives very far from these sites and commutes very far to the beach and isn't going anywhere near there, let us know and we might be able to mail you out that badge. In general, again, if you have questions now or later, you're going to contact Deep NCON police for those takes or those birds being harassed or attacked by people. Obviously, call 911 for any typical standard emergency, just as you would in any other aspect of life. You're going to email CTDeep and Wildlife, CTDeep Wildlife and AAfCW at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com as soon as possible about new nest, damaged fencing or signage, predator or lost nest, injured birds, those kind of in-between things that you're not too sure of that are notable but not an emergency or a bird being attacked, and go above and beyond the ordinary day-to-day monitoring. But when it comes to the basic stuff, whether it's scheduling, monitoring, bird ID and assistance, putting in typical data, inquiring paperwork, data entry, weather, predators and people, RSVing to fencing parties, showing pictures or videos, just email ctwaterbirds@gmail.com anytime. And I believe that's it for me. So thanks everyone. And now we'll take a bunch more questions.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Corey.
Yeah, so we are open to questions at this point. Anybody, if you've got a question about, you know, what data to enter or where to pick up data, you know, where to pick up various forms, you know, anything, we are open to questions right now.
To the question in the chat, thank you on the pictures. I used a Nikon D850 primarily, or Nikon D750 and a 500 millimeter Nikkor lens. So they're going pretty far and they're being cropped a lot. So when you see pictures that I put up throughout the year, again, keep in mind, even if they look close, I'm really just using the equipment for that.
Okay, well,
I have a question, sorry.
yes, go ahead.
This is for Scott. So we live in Woolkit. We really don't live near the shore. And I get the whole thing about April 15th to come down, and I guess there's a training then. Could you go over the process, because this is our first time, and do we have to go somewhere prior to April 15th to get all the paperwork, or can we do it all that day?
You can do everything that day. We're going to send you electronically the waiver form and all the other paperwork. The only thing you really need to pick up in person is a badge and a lanyard, which we can provide you with that day. And then you can also at the same time hand your waiver form in.
Oh, great. Okay, that would be perfect. So
okay,
should we email you, and how do we get you to send us that?
We're going to email everything out as we go through this month. Obviously, we're doing it pretty early this year because it's still March 11th. We're not quite to April yet, but we have our returning volunteer monitor session next week for those who have monitored in the past. So once we get past these two, we're going to do everything from putting this on YouTube so you can review it, to updating all the documents and the forms for the season, getting those up on the blog, ctwaterbirds.blogspot.com, emailing everything from ctwaterbirds@gmail.com to all of our monitors, and just kind of doing all the logistics and the paperwork in the next few weeks so that we're all set. Once we get to April, again, for new monitors, you're going to still probably be getting acclimated. You're going to finalize your schedule then and get a feel for going to field training and that sort of thing. Our past monitors will start monitoring pretty quickly. And then once we get past April 15th, we'll be in good shape for everybody to get out in the field and hopefully feel very comfortable with it as well.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
One other thing I'll mention is that, Scott mentioned you need to pick up your badges. We also have t-shirts that are available for new volunteers to purchase for $10, and those will also be available at the field training and then at the 2 other locations that Scott noted for picking up, whatchamacallit, what's the word I'm looking for?
Badges,
Badges, yes.
Yeah, your lanyards too for new people, yes.
Yeah, and then they're gray for volunteers, but they have the Audubon Alliance logo here. All the various partner logos on the back, and then the staff ones say staff, the volunteer ones say volunteers, but they're nice quality t-shirts. And the reason for the t-shirts, is that we have had a lot of conversations with the environmental conservation officers that work for the state of Connecticut, and they really think there's a lot of value in us looking more official. So we've been trying to provide, t-shirts for returning volunteers. They're free for new volunteers. We ask you to pay $10. The full cost of the t-shirt is $30, so $10 is a bargain. So, just letting you know about them.
There's the question in the chat of what's happening at Stratford Point. Stratford Point right now has passed to Connecticut Audubon Society and is a work in progress. And if Patrick wants to talk about that or anybody else wants to talk about that more, that's fine. In terms of our birds, Stratford Point is not a site where we have any nesting going on. It's a really great migratory site. So if you want to see great migratory shorebirds, that's a good place to visit, but they don't nest there.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending today's training. Scott is going to be sending out emails with various information. If you haven't talked to him already about where you'd like to monitor, that would be sort of the next step, is to figure out where you want to monitor and approximately how many times a month, and approximately what day. Definitely keep an eye out for Scott's emails, and myself and Scott and Laura will stay on for a few more minutes in case there's any more questions. But thank you all for attending, and thank you for being available to help out with the monitoring of these beach nesting birds this year. We are grateful to have your assistance.